Hello and welcome back to Coin Rich's channel. Some coins pass through our hands so quietly that we never stop to look at them. They sit in drawers, rest at the bottom of jars, or disappear into the flow of everyday spending without leaving a trace. And yet, every so often, one of those ordinary-looking coins carries a story so powerful that it rewrites everything we think we know about money, history, and value. The 1971 United States half-dollar is one of those coins that at first glance, there is nothing about it that demands attention. Its size is familiar. Its design feels reassuringly traditional. It carries the face of a president whose image has been stamped into American memory for generations. To most people, it looks like nothing more than a relic of loose change from another era. But coins like this are not defined by first impressions. They are defined by what time reveals. To understand why the 1971 half-dollar matters, you have to return to the moment it was born. The early 1970s were not a calm or comfortable time in America. Confidence in institutions was shaken. Inflation was creeping into daily life. The country was redefining its relationship with money, value, and trust. Precious metals were disappearing from circulation, and the familiar weight of silver was quietly being replaced by new compositions that felt lighter, cheaper, and uncertain. For decades, Americans had associated real money with substance. Coins had weight. They rang with a distinct sound when dropped on a counter. They felt permanent. But by 1971, that era was ending. The country was transitioning into something new, and many people did not realize what they were losing until it was already gone. The half-dollar was caught directly in the middle of this transformation. Once a coin people respected and used, it began to fade from everyday commerce. Fewer were seen in pockets. Fewer appeared in cash registers. Slowly, almost unnoticed, the half-dollar started to disappear from daily life. Even though it was still being produced in large numbers, the Denver Mint struck the 1971 half-dollar during this period of uncertainty. Millions were made, and that fact alone led many to believe the coin would never be special. After all, how could something produced in such quantity ever become rare? How could a coin that sat untouched in bank rolls or drawers possibly turn into something extraordinary? That assumption is where the story truly begins, because rarity is not always created at the moment of minting. Sometimes, it is created by neglect. Sometimes, it is shaped by misunderstanding. And sometimes, it is forged by a combination of subtle details that only reveal their importance decades later. Collectors who have spent their lives studying coins understand something most people do not. They know that value is not simply about how many coins were made. It is about how many survived unchanged. It is about condition, precision, timing, and mistakes that were never meant to exist. It is about the quiet anomalies that slip past quality control and enter the world unnoticed. The 1971 half-dollar exists at a crossroads of history and craftsmanship. It was struck using methods that were transitioning from old traditions to newer industrial efficiencies. Dies were pushed harder. Production schedules were tighter. And when that happens, small deviations can occur. The kind that do not announce themselves. The kind that require patience, experience, and an educated eye to detect. Most people who encounter this coin never look closely enough to see those differences. They glance at the date, maybe notice the mint mark, and move on. But to someone who understands coins, the surface tells a story. The strike quality, the depth of detail, the alignment, the texture of the metal itself, all whisper clues about how that particular piece came into existence. What makes this coin especially fascinating is that it belongs to a year that marked a psychological shift. People were losing confidence in physical money even as they depended on it more than ever. Savings felt fragile. Futures felt uncertain. And in times like those, objects that endure take on new meaning. Many of these half-dollars were never circulated. Banks stored them. The public ignored them. Over time, they were forgotten. And yet, forgotten does not mean worthless. In fact, forgotten coins often become the most dangerous kind, because they sit quietly while history works in their favor. Decades passed. The world changed. Technology reshaped finance. Digital transactions replaced the sound of coins on counters. And slowly, collectors began looking back at the transitional years with new curiosity. They realized that coins from periods of economic and material change often held hidden significance. The 1971 half dollar was re-examined with fresh eyes, that is when subtle distinctions started to matter. Coins that once seemed identical were suddenly understood to be very different. Strike sharpness varied dramatically. Certain examples displayed extraordinary clarity in areas that were typically weak. Some showed anomalies that suggested unusual die conditions or limited production circumstances. To the untrained observer, these differences are invisible. But to experienced collectors, they are unmistakable. And in a market driven by precision, those differences can separate the ordinary from the exceptional. There is also something deeply emotional about this coin. It represents the last breath of an era when American coinage still carried the dignity of weight and permanence, even as it stepped into a future of compromise. It is a reminder of what was lost, and what quietly endured. People who collect coins seriously are not just chasing metal. They are preserving moments. They are safeguarding physical evidence of decisions made by governments, mints, and societies. And coins like the 1971 half dollar become symbols of those decisions. Over time, stories began circulating among collectors. Quiet conversations. Auction whispers. Private evaluations. Coins that once traded for face value were suddenly being examined under magnification, their provenance questioned, their surfaces studied with reverence, and here is the truth that surprises most people. The majority of 1971 half dollars will never be worth more than they appear to be. They will remain exactly what they seem. But a very small number exist on a different level entirely. Coins that meet criteria so strict that most examples fail instantly, that is where fascination turns into obsession. Because anyone could be holding one and never know it. It could sit in a box inherited from a parent. It could rest in a roll purchased decades ago and forgotten. It could be lying in a safe, dismissed as ordinary, while carrying a potential that defies belief. This possibility is what keeps collectors searching. It is what keeps them examining coins late into the night, under harsh light, comparing details that most people would never notice. It is the thrill of knowing that history sometimes hides its most valuable secrets in plain sight. The 1971 half dollar is not valuable because it is flashy. It is valuable because it is quiet. Because it requires patience. Because it rewards those who understand that real worth is often invisible at first glance, and that is why this coin continues to pull people in. Not because of hype. Not because of rumor. But because it stands at the intersection of history, craftsmanship, and time. A place where ordinary objects sometimes become extraordinary, not overnight, but over decades. What happens next in this story is where everything changes. Because when you begin to understand exactly what separates the common from the exceptional, the coin in your hand stops being just a coin. It becomes a question. A possibility. A moment of realization that can alter how you see value forever. Once the possibility enters your mind that an ordinary-looking coin might be something far more, you begin to see it differently. You turn it over more slowly. You notice how the light moves across the surface. You become aware of details that once felt irrelevant. This is exactly what happened as serious collectors began revisiting the 1971 half dollar with renewed intensity. What they discovered was not a single dramatic feature, but a pattern of quiet excellence that appeared only in a tiny fraction of examples. These coins stood apart not because they shouted for attention, but because they whispered precision. The portrait carried an unusual sharpness. The hairlines showed depth rather than softness. The lettering appeared confident and complete, not blurred or shallow as seen on most strikes from that year. In mass production, perfection is rare. Machines wear down. Dies lose their edge. Pressure fluctuates. By the time a mint has produced millions of coins, the majority show signs of compromise. That is what makes the exceptional ones so compelling. They represent a moment when everything aligned just right, even if only briefly. For the 1971 half dollar, those moments were fleeting. The Denver Mint was operating at a pace designed for efficiency, not artistry. Coins were produced to meet demand, not to impress future collectors. Yet within that environment, a handful of pieces emerged that seemed almost defiant in their quality. Collectors began to categorize these coins not by their date alone, but by their presence. They looked for examples that seemed to carry more authority, more confidence in their strike. Coins that looked as though they had something to say. Then there were the anomalies. No minting process is flawless, especially during times of transition. Changes in materials, pressure, and equipment introduce variables that cannot always be controlled. Occasionally, those variables leave behind subtle fingerprints. Slight deviations in alignment. Unusual surface textures. Variations that fall outside what was expected, but not outside what was possible. These are not errors in the dramatic sense that most people imagine. They are not obvious misprints or glaring mistakes. They are the kind of differences that reveal themselves only when compared against hundreds of other examples. They reward experience, not luck. As word spread quietly through collecting circles, attention intensified. Coins once dismissed were pulled from storage and examined again. Rolls were opened. Old collections were re-evaluated. And in some cases, long-held assumptions were overturned. What made this process especially compelling was the fact that many of these coins had been preserved unintentionally. Because half dollars fell out of favor in everyday transactions, many were never exposed to the wear that destroys potential. They sat untouched, protected by indifference. Time, paradoxically, became their greatest ally. As decades passed, the population of truly pristine examples shrank. Coins were lost. Mishandled. Cleaned improperly. Exposed to environments that dulled their surfaces or introduced damage invisible to the untrained eye but fatal to collector value. Meanwhile, standards in the numismatic world became more exacting. Grading grew more precise. Evaluation more rigorous. The bar for what qualified as exceptional rose steadily. This is where the story becomes personal, because the difference between a coin worth a modest premium and one that commands extraordinary attention often comes down to choices made long ago by someone who never imagined the future. Someone who set a coin aside rather than spending it. Someone who resisted the urge to polish it. Someone who simply forgot it existed. Those small acts of restraint can echo across generations. Collectors who understand this do not rush. They do not chase every rumor. They approach coins like the 1971 half dollar with a mix of respect and skepticism. They know that for every extraordinary piece, there are thousands that look similar but fall short. This discipline is what separates seasoned collectors from casual observers. It is also what gives coins like this their mystique. Because they force patience. They demand knowledge. They punish assumptions. There is also a psychological weight attached to coins from this era. The early 1970s represented a breaking point. A moment when trust in systems faltered, and people began questioning the stability of what they once took for granted. Holding a coin from that time feels like holding a fragment of that uncertainty. It is not just metal. It is memory, and memory has value. As the years moved on, a small number of 1971 half dollars began appearing in contexts that made people pause. Not because they were advertised loudly, but because of where they surfaced and who was interested. Private transactions. Serious inquiries. Evaluations conducted behind closed doors. This is how significant coins often move. Not through spectacle, but through silence. Collectors understood that announcing interest too loudly attracts speculation. It distorts the market. True value reveals itself slowly, through consensus among those who have nothing to gain by exaggeration. What emerged was an understanding that this coin, in its highest expressions, occupied a space few expected. It was no longer just a product of its year. It was a benchmark. A standard against which others were measured. And yet, the most remarkable part of this story is not what experts know. It is what most people do not. There are still examples out there that have never been properly examined. Coins inherited without context. Collections stored without documentation. Pieces passed down with vague stories and little understanding. These coins exist in a state of suspension. Their potential unrealized. Their significance unrecognized. This is why the 1971 half dollar continues to captivate. It is not a closed chapter. It is an open question: could one be sitting unnoticed right now? Could a coin dismissed decades ago be waiting for the moment when someone finally looks closely enough? That possibility is not fantasy. It is history repeating itself. Every generation rediscovers value. It looks back and sees meaning where previous generations saw utility. Coins are especially vulnerable to this shift because they are so easy to underestimate. They are small, familiar, mundane, until they are not. As collectors reach the later stages of their careers, many reflect on what they have learned. They speak less about profit and more about recognition. About the satisfaction of identifying something special when others could not. About being patient enough to let time confirm what intuition suggested. The 1971 $half rewards that mindset. It does not reveal itself to those looking for shortcuts. It does not respond to hype. It requires a willingness to listen to what history is quietly saying, and what history is saying, in this case, is that transformation does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides behind familiarity. Sometimes it chooses the most ordinary object imaginable and turns it into something extraordinary: the craftsmanship, the timing, the rarity, the market realization, and ultimately, the number that forces people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about this coin. When all the pieces finally come together, the story of the 1971 $half stops being about curiosity and becomes something far more confronting. Because this is the moment when assumptions collapse. When the quiet details that once seemed insignificant form a picture that can no longer be ignored. For years, the coin lived in a kind of limbo. Known, but not fully understood. Present, but not fully appreciated. It was easy to dismiss it as a transitional artifact, a reminder of shifting materials and changing habits. But that dismissal was built on surface-level thinking. And surface-level thinking is the enemy of discovery. What ultimately changed everything was not hype or rumor, but verification. The slow, methodical process of separating the truly exceptional from the merely acceptable. Coins were examined under unforgiving standards. Compared not just to others of the same year, but to the finest examples across multiple decades, and some of them held their ground. These coins showed a level of preservation so uncommon that it challenged expectations. Surfaces remained undisturbed. Edges were sharp. Details that should have softened with time remained assertive. There was no evidence of cleaning, no hidden damage, no compromises disguised by age. In the world of serious collecting, that combination is rare. In the context of a coin most people consider ordinary, it is extraordinary. As understanding deepened, so did restraint. No one rushed to declare conclusions. The numismatic community has learned hard lessons about premature claims. Value must be earned, not announced. It must survive scrutiny from those who have no emotional investment in the outcome, and survive it did. What became clear was that the finest 1971 $half occupy a category so narrow that it barely exists on paper. A convergence of strike quality, surface integrity, and historical placement that almost never happens by accident. This is where time plays its final role. Decades of attrition have taken their toll. Coins that once met high standards no longer do. Handling, storage mistakes, and environmental exposure have quietly reduced the population of elite survivors. Each passing year makes the remaining examples more isolated. Scarcity, in this context, is not theoretical. It is measurable, and with measurable scarcity comes a shift in perception. What was once overlooked becomes contested. What was once ignored becomes pursued. Interest intensifies not because of trend, but because of realization. Collectors who once passed over the 1971 $half begin to reconsider. Institutions take note. Private buyers ask different questions. The conversation changes from whether the coin matters to how few truly qualify. This shift is subtle, but irreversible. It also explains why most people will never encounter one of these elite examples. Not because they are hidden, but because they are already spoken for. Held tightly by those who understand exactly what they have and why time is working in their favor. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition. History is filled with objects that were once common and later revered. Coins, paintings, manuscripts, even everyday tools. Value does not announce itself in the moment. It reveals itself when perspective changes. The 1971 half dollar followed that exact path. It began as a product of efficiency. It survived through neglect. It matured through scarcity. And it emerged as something entirely different from what it was meant to be. For viewers watching this story unfold, the most unsettling realization is often the simplest one. That the line between ordinary and extraordinary is thinner than anyone likes to admit. That context, not appearance, determines worth. That time, not intention, decides significance. There is also a personal dimension to this story that cannot be ignored. Many people watching are old enough to remember when half dollars still appeared in circulation. When they were handed back as change. When they felt heavier in the palm than other coins. That memory creates a bridge between past and present, between familiarity and revelation. It forces a question that lingers long after the video ends: what else have we underestimated? Because the 1971 half dollar is not an isolated case. It is a reminder. A warning. A lesson in humility. It tells us that value does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a disguise so convincing that it takes generations to see through it. The final confirmation of this coin's status did not come with celebration. It came with acceptance. The kind that settles in quietly when the evidence leaves no room for argument. At that point, numbers stop being abstract. When a coin reaches the highest tier of recognition, value is no longer about comparison. It becomes about precedent. About what someone is willing to give up to own something that cannot be replaced. And that is where the story ends, not with surprise, but with understanding. Because once you grasp how few of these coins truly exist in elite condition, once you understand how perfectly circumstances had to align for one to survive unchanged for more than half a century, the final figure no longer feels impossible. It feels inevitable. Today, the most extraordinary verified example of the 1971 United States half dollar has reached a valuation that few would have believed possible when it left the Denver Mint. That coin is now valued at $2 million, and the most remarkable part is not the number itself, but how quietly it earned it.